Continuing on with our discussion of late adulthood, we're going to be talking about psychosocial development now. And in terms of the theories of late adulthood, I mentioned last time that development is more diverse in late adulthood than at any other age because essentially we've had more environmental experiences that have shaped us in late adulthood than we have at any of the earlier stages, simply because we've been around longer. And so we see that some elderly people are able to run marathons and lead nations, and others are no longer able to move or even think. So a great deal of variety is seen at this stage. And many social scientists have tried to understand both the variations as well as the general course of old age. So we'd like to understand what is it that allows some people to be able to run marathons while others, and what are the factors that contribute to some individuals developing dementia at the same age. But we'd also like to identify, what are the similarities that can explain just generally what happens to people as they enter this period of late adulthood. And as always, in order to try to understand these things, we need to talk about the different theories of adulthood. And self theories are those theories of late adulthood that emphasize the core self, or the search to maintain one's integrity and identity. And Erickson, of course, talked about integrity versus despair, in fact, in his final stage of psychosocial development. And in this stage, he said that older adults are seeking to integrate their unique experiences with their vision of community. Most older adults consider their personalities and attitudes to have remained quite stable over their lifespan, even as they recognize the physical changes of their bodies. So it turns out that when you ask most people, are you pretty much the same person you are now that you were when you were younger, they typically say yes. Obviously some people will have changed pretty drastically, but for the most part, most people tend to remain relatively stable in terms of these personality traits and things like that. Objects and places become more precious in late adulthood than they were earlier as a way to hold on to identity. So one way that we can see this is that there's a tendency to cling to familiar places and possessions, and this can be seen in its most extreme form in terms of compulsive hoarding, where it becomes literally impossible for an individual to give certain things up, and so they just accumulate, and that's what the hoarding behavior is. And it's so hard to get rid of those things because they sort of represent us, pieces of us, in other words. Now, continuity theory is the theory that each person experiences the changes of late adulthood and behaves toward others in a way that's consistent with his or her behavior in earlier periods of life, as I just indicated. In this perspective, each innovation is a new expression of the old self, and one source of continuity is temperament. So we talked about temperament in infant development. That's sort of rather than having a personality, we typically characterize infants as having different temperaments, and we see that there's a relationship between the type of temperament that infants have and their later personality traits, and this includes personality traits in late adulthood as well. So we talked about the big 5 personality traits previously in chapter 13, and these are maintained throughout old age as they were in the younger years. We also talked about selective optimization with compensation, and this is a central part of the self theories, where once again we select out of a number of different options, what's the most valuable thing to us, and then once we've selected that, we really try to optimize and get the most out of that thing that we've chosen. And when we encounter difficulties and things become more difficult than they used to be, we look for ways to try to compensate for those deficits. And one place that we see the selective optimization and compensation model applied is in something called the positivity effect. The positivity effect is a tendency for older people to perceive, prefer, and remember positive images and experiences more so than negative ones. Selective memory is sort of seen as a way to compensate for whatever troubles occur. In other words, if we tend to remember things better than they actually were. So, if I asked you how much did you, enjoy reading this book, right now, you rated it, and then I asked you, in a year from now, how much did you enjoy that book? You might rate it as more enjoyable than you had actually rated it at the time. Now that's probably not the best example, but in terms of different life experiences that you've had, that tends to be more so the case. And then unpleasant experiences are actually reinterpreted as inconsequential. And so this positivity effect essentially has the effect that we're happy, we're generally happier because we tend to see life as having been more positive rather than negative. So self-perception, it normally tilts toward integrity rather than despair, and research on what people hope for themselves, and this is often referred to as the ideal self, how we would be ideally, and how we actually perceive ourselves, which is the real self. The two selves come closer together with age. In other words, right now we may not see ourselves, our real selves, as being as close to the ideal self as we might like. Maybe we'd like to change certain things about ourselves, to improve upon ourselves. But as we get older, we tend to see those two as being closer together. That is, our real self is closer, is a better reflection of our ideal self than it is at younger ages. So as self-theory contends, self-acceptance tends to lead to happiness. Now, in contrast to the self-theories, there are also stratification theories. And these are theories that emphasize the social forces, particularly those related to a person's social stratum or social category, that limit individual choices and affect a person's ability to function in late adulthood, as past stratification continues to limit life in various ways. So undoubtedly, there are certain things in terms of environmental factors that impact upon us and sort of push us to develop certain ways. So, for example, if I was, as much as I would have liked to have been a professional football player, if I was 5 feet tall and weighed 100 pounds soaking wet, chances are I'm probably not going to get there. And so, there are these environmental constraints that have sort of affected the path that I took. I didn't become an NFL football player, and instead I decided to go into a different path. So in terms of the different ways that stratification can occur, it can occur by age. So in industrialized nations, we tend to see segregation of elderly people, gradually shunting them out of the mainstream of society as they grow older. And segregation by age harms everyone because it creates socialization deficits for members of all groups. In other words, if we don't interact with anyone other than people from our own age group, we're really missing out on valuable lessons that could be learned by interacting with others of different age groups. So we really wouldn't learn anything from our elders' past experiences if we don't socialize with them. And a couple of theories had come out of these the stratification theory. One is disengagement theory. This was the view that aging makes a person's social sphere increasingly narrow, resulting in role relinquishment, withdrawal, and passivity. Now, this was quite a controversial theory because it seemed to be quite ageist in the sense that it was the view of older adults was that they want to disengage from society, and that's not necessarily the case. There may be it may be a result of a bias against elderly adults that makes it seem as if they want to disengage, but in fact, maybe they don't really want to. Activity theory is the view that elderly people want and need to remain active in a variety of social spheres with relatives, friends, and community groups, and become withdrawn only unwillingly as a result of ageism. So that's kind of the opposite of disengagement theory. And in reality, as we often see, it's not as if one theory is 100% correct and other theories are 0% correct. It's usually some sort of mixture. And in other words, some older adults do prefer to disengage, even though that may not necessarily characterize most older adults' experiences. That is the case for some individuals, and we do see that a majority of older adults do tend to behave in ways consistent with activity theory, in the sense that they attempt to or want to remain active in their social spheres. And in particular, one way that we see older adults maintaining their activities is through work. So the activities of older people are intense and varied. Some will be working and some will be retired. The psychological benefits of work can be obtained either through traditional work or through volunteer work. And work generally tends to provide social support, status, and boosting self-esteem. And for many people, employment is what permits them to achieve generativity, which we talked about as Erikson's seventh stage, generativity versus stagnation. Besides needing the money, some employees over age 65 stay on the job because they appreciate the social recognition and self-fulfillment that work brings. Many people once believed that older adults were healthier and happier when they were employed than when they were unemployed, and that retirement led to illness and death. But that turns out not to be the case. It's only really when retirement is precipitated by poor health or fading competence that it correlates with illness. Otherwise, retirement is generally experienced as more of a positive thing than a negative thing for older adults. So if we look at, in terms of the volunteer work, if we look at the percentage of individuals who volunteer at different ages, we see that it's actually the people in middle adulthood that are doing the most volunteering, although this may be biased in terms of what the volunteer work actually includes, because if you were to also take into consideration things like childcare that grandparents may provide, then we might see much higher values over here for these older adults here as well. But in terms of traditional volunteer work, it's middle-aged adults who seem to be doing the most. One thing that we see is that one of the favorite activities of many retirees is caring for their own homes. And in keeping up with household tasks and maintaining their property, many older people demonstrate that they prefer to age in place. So aging in place refers to the fact that most individuals do not want to move out of their the place that they have been living in, their homes, in other words, for a long time, even though it may be easier to move out of a home where you're responsible for managing everything in order to move into, say, an apartment complex where you no longer have to do things like mow the lawn, shovel the driveway, things like that. But what you see is that, again, older adults, they do tend to prefer to stay in the homes that they've been in. They want to stay in the same dwelling where they lived as younger adults, adjusting but not leaving when their health begins to fade. Now, there are also naturally occurring retirement communities, and these are neighborhoods or apartment complexes whose population is mostly retired people who moved to the location as young adults and then never left. So because they never left, even though they moved there as young adults, it sort of transitioned into this naturally occurring retirement community, just as the name sort of suggests is the case. And an important reason for both aging in place and naturally occurring retirement communities is the social convoy, the result of years of close relationships. So part of the reason of not wanting to leave one's home probably has to do with the fact that they've developed many social relationships with individuals in the neighborhoods, and so even leaving that neighborhood would be adverse in the sense of perhaps missing out on some of those close relationships that one's used to having. We also see sort of an increase in the amount of older adults engaging in continuing education. About 1 out of 5 U.S. adults aged 66 and older was enrolled in some kind of continuing education in 2005, and most elderly adults are motivated primarily by a desire for personal or social improvement. And in some ways, late adulthood is an ideal time for learning. It's not uncommon for older adults who are taking courses to take them a bit more seriously because they sort of recognize the value of the material that they're learning about, and they also are taking it less out of obligation and more out of just an interest in the subject. In terms of religious involvement, older adults are less likely to attend religious services than are middle-aged, and although this is typically used as a measure of how religious someone is by how often they attend religious services, it's not always the most accurate measurement, because even though they are less likely to attend religious services, faith increases with age, and so does praying and other religious practices. So when we look at the data closely, we find that it's really just their attending of religious services that might decrease. And religious institutions fulfill many needs, and a nearby house of worship is one reason that American elders may also prefer to age in place. In terms of political activism, we see that fewer older adults turn out for massive rallies, and only about 2% volunteer in political campaigns. But more older people write letters to their elected representatives, they vote, and they identify with a political party. And many government policies that affect the elderly, especially those regarding housing, pensions, prescription drugs, and medical costs, are extremely relevant to those individuals. So they do tend to show an interest, even though once again, you might not see political activity in all areas, such as participating in rallies or campaigns. They do take part in many ways, such as voting and writing letters and things like that. In terms of friends and relatives in older adulthood, we see that spouses tend to buffer each other against problems associated with old age, and thus are also believed to play a role in extending life. Married older adults are often healthier, wealthier, and happier than unmarried people their age. And in particular, shared laughter is one characteristic of long-term married couples that is very beneficial in the sense that they often mirror each other's moods. And thanks to the positivity effect, the mood is often one of joy. So even though they might mirror each other's moods, regardless of whether they're positive or negative, again, since as older adults age, they tend to focus more on the positive side of things and the more pleasant emotions. That has a benefit for this mirroring of moods in their partners. One of the amazing aspects of long-term relationships is how interdependent the partners become over time. Another aspect of long-term marriages is that they tend to have great mutual respect for one another, and generally older spouses accept each other's frailties, assisting with the partner's physical and psychological needs. Regarding the impact of retirement, in addition to relinquishing the work role, retirees must usually adjust to the marriage interaction, now that they'll be spending more time at home with their spouse. And sometimes this increased interaction precipitates relationship conflicts. In other words, you have to get used to, perhaps seeing more of one another, or if really it's more problematic, not so much when both individuals retire. In fact, that's associated with more positive outcomes, but it's more so when one spouse retires and the other one does not, that you tend to see more problems. Death of a spouse is another common event that long married older adults must face in the death must face as they get older. Particularly, this is the case for women, because they tend to outlive men. And adjustment to being widowed is especially difficult during the first 2 years after the death. And because women, as I mentioned, they tend to marry older men, and also because men tend to not live as long, the average married woman will experience 4 to 10 years of widowhood, whereas the average man does not experience widowerhood. In the past centuries, most adults died before their grandchildren were born, and this is a trend that has changed pretty drastically, because once again, individuals are living longer and longer lives, and that means that there will be more generations living at the same time. And today, some families span as many as 5 generations. And the term beanpole family is used to refer to multiple generations being alive, but only a few members in each one. And that has to do with the fact that individuals are having fewer and fewer offspring in each generation. So there are more members of more generations of a family around, but less individuals within each generation. And that's where that beanpole analogy comes from. So although elderly people's relationships with members of younger generations are usually positive, they can also include tension and conflict. Few older adults stop parenting simply because their children are grown. That can be certainly a source of conflict between older adults and their grown children. And adult children, they also imagine parental disapproval, even if it's not outwardly expressed. And so that can also be another source of difficulty. So here's what we were talking about before with the idea of the beanpole family, that you can have multiple generations in a family line alive, but there tend to be fewer individuals that make up each generation, again because of the fact that people are tending to have fewer and fewer children. Feelings of familism prompt siblings, cousins, and even more distant relatives to seek out one another, and so family becomes very important in older adulthood because of this feeling of familism. And filial responsibility refers to the obligation of an adult child to care for their aging parents. This is a major goal among adults in the United States, is to be self-sufficient. And adult children may be more willing to offer support than their parents are to receive it. In other words, even when adult children are perfectly willing to support their parents and help them in ways, those parents, those older adults, may not be very receptive to help. They want to be seen as independent and self-sufficient, as that's a valued trait in the United States, at least. Extensive research has found that relationships between parents and adult children are affected by many factors. One, assistance arises from need and from the ability to provide. Frequency of contact is related to geographical proximity, not affection. Love is influenced by the interaction remembered from early childhood. So once again, we see that even things that took place in childhood are still having that really long-lasting effect into adulthood. And sons often feel a stronger obligation toward their parents, whereas daughters tend to feel stronger affection toward their parents. So most most elders over age 65 have become grandparents, and there are numerous factors that influence the nature of the grandparent-grandchild relationship. Things such as personality, ethnicity, national background, past family interactions, and of course the age and personality of the childhood all influence the type of relationship that a grandchild has with his or her grandparent. And in the United States, contemporary grandparents seem to follow one of four approaches to dealing with their grandchildren. There are the remote grandparents, sometimes called distant grandparents, because they tend to be sort of emotionally distant from their grandchildren. There are companionate grandparents, sometimes called fun-loving grandparents, who tend to entertain and spoil their grandchildren. And this probably makes up the largest portion of grandparenting types, is the companionate type. Involved grandparents are active in the day-to-day lives of their grandchildren, and this may or may not be welcomed by parents at times. And then there's the surrogate role, where surrogate parents raise their grandchildren, and this most of the time is because parents are unable or unwilling to do so. And so this tends to be often a burdensome role that grandparents tend to take on. Many middle-aged adults, married and unmarried, have no children, and so friends become a very important source of socialization. Elderly people who have spent a lifetime without a spouse usually have friendships, activities, and social connections, and all the research tends to find that older adults need at least one close companion. And that close companion can sometimes be a friend. It doesn't necessarily have to be a spouse or a relative. Now, some elderly individuals will, as we mentioned at the very beginning, be in really tip-top health, whereas others will be on sort of the opposite side of the spectrum. And this opposite side of the spectrum is called the frail elderly. So people over age 65 and more often over age 85 who are physically infirm, very ill, or cognitively disabled are considered frail elderly. Most adults become frail if they live long enough, and frailty is most common in the months preceding death. So this is probably related to that idea that we talked about called terminal drop, where there tends to be a sharp decline in one's health immediately preceding their death. And in terms of how do we characterize who constitutes a frail elderly person from one who's not? Well, there are two different types of activities that we can look at. One is called activities of daily living, or ADLs, and these are actions that are important to independent living, and they are typically identified as 5 tasks of self-care: eating, bathing, toileting, dressing, and transferring from a bed to a chair. And difficulties in any one of these areas can significantly reduce one's ability to live independently. And so an inability to perform any of these tasks is thus a sign of frailty. Now, a little bit more cognitively complex form of ADLs is called instrumental activities of daily living. Okay? These are actions, for example, paying bills and driving a car, that are important to independent living and that require some intellectual competence and forethought. So really, it's the way that we differentiate what constitutes an ADL from an IADL is really the degree of intellectual competence that's required for it. And the ability to perform these tasks may be even more critical to self-sufficiency than ADL ability. So in terms of some examples of instrumental activities of daily living, you've got managing medications, shopping for necessities, managing one's finances, using transportation, using the telephone, maintaining one's household, and also meal preparation and nutrition. So it's one thing to be able to eat for yourself. It's another thing to be able to prepare your own meals. So that's, again, the difference between the ADL, the eating, and the IADL, the actual preparing of a meal, and also ensuring that you get adequate nutritional values from the foods that you eat. In terms of caring for the frail elderly, we see that family caregivers often experience substantial stress during caregiving, and their health may suffer, and their risk of depression increases, especially if the care receiver has dementia. And in the United States, the spouse is the usual caregiver. Now, obviously, in the absence of a spouse, the children become the next most likely caregivers. Even in ideal circumstances with community support, family caregiving can present a number of problems. If one child is the primary caregiver, other siblings tend to feel either relief or sometimes even jealousy. Caregivers and care receivers often disagree about things like schedules, menus, doctor visits, and so on. And resentments on both sides can disrupt mutual affection and appreciation. And public agencies rarely provide services unless an emergency arises. So again, the burden really does tend to be on family members. When caregiving results in resentment and social isolation, the risk of depression, poor health, and abuse of elderly escalates. And abuse is much more likely under certain conditions. It's most likely when the caregiver is a feeble person who suffers severe memory loss, or the caregiver is a drug addicted relative, or when care occurs in an isolated place, and when when visitors are few and far between. So, as unfortunate and as much as we'd like to think abuse of elderly does not occur, it's a pretty significant problem. Most research finds that about 5% of elders say that they were abused, but up to 1/4 of all elders are vulnerable and may not report abuse. Elders who are mistreated by family members are often ashamed to admit it. And today, outright abuse is now quite rare in nursing homes. And in the United States, the trend over the past 20 years has been toward fewer nursing home residents. Currently, about 1.5 million people nationwide. The major difference between nursing home and other types of assisted living are that the nursing home is 24 hours, 7 days a week care. Assisted living, on the other hand, is a living arrangement for elderly people that combines privacy and independence with medical supervision. So assisted living facilities range from group homes for 3 or 4 elderly people to large apartments or townhouse developments for hundreds of residents. And of course, healthier individuals are much more likely to be found in assisted living facilities, whereas those who have relatively poor health status are much more likely to end up in a nursing home. So it really depends on the amount of care that's needed for the individual that's going to determine which option they're most likely to go with.